Great. Hopefully this will work.
Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are joined by Rabbi Tuvia Berman, and we are going to be exploring the Chavos Yair's approach on what we should actually be spending our time learning. As a host of a podcast about Shalos and Shuvos, I am already shaking in fear of what the answer might be. But before we jump into it, Rabbi Berman is the Director of Institutional Advancement at Yeshivat Eretz HaTzvi. In addition, he has held numerous posts in education from the high school level through adult education. A graduate of Columbia University and Harvard Graduate School, he learned at Yeshivat Har Etzion and received Semikha from Yeshivat HaMivtar in Efrat. He founded the Jewish Learning Initiative on campus, JLIC, at Brandeis University, and served as the rabbinic advisory to the Orthodox community there for several years. Previously, he was a Ram at Midreshet Lindenbaum, and he currently lives in Efrat. Now, Rabbi Berman, I'm very excited because the Chavos Yair Eschatayani Maskir Hayom has been sitting on my shelf collecting dust a little bit since the last time we did an episode on this, which was back in the earlier days of the podcast. So before jumping into the particulars of the tshuva itself, maybe remind me and our listeners a little bit about the Chavos Yair, historically who he was, the nature of the sefer, and then we'll get to the particulars of what it promises to be a fascinating tshuva.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi Kurtz. I'm really excited about this. Uh, the Chavos Yair is a fascinating set of tshuvot. He was a great halachist in the 17th century, a direct descendant of the Maharal, and that's going to play a major role in his thought process. I already see you smiling, so you understand exactly some of the critiques of education he received from his maternal, it's his maternal, I think, maternal great-great-grandfather or great-great-great-grandfather. He lived in some of the most difficult times, or I guess a difficult time. I guess it's hard to say most difficult times now in Israel right now. We're going through a war. We just had a commemoration for one of our madrichim who is unfortunately died in combat. It's been a very difficult time, but he also lived in a difficult time. The uprising, the Khmelnytsky massacres, in uprisings in Poland, the Swedish-Russian War, Shabtai Tzvi. He basically saw a lot of very difficult issues and became a rabbi. His father was a well-known rabbi, and he became a very well-accepted rabbi eventually in Germany and passed away in Germany. He wrote several books which were not published. One book, maybe it was his magnum opus, was a sefer called Makor Chaim, which was in manuscript until 1982, when Makom Yerushalayim published it, which is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, which is going to fit very much in his biography as well, or in the tshuva that we're going to look at in a second. He was very concerned with Yeshivat Orach Chaim. He decided not to publish it, kind of in a way reminiscent of the problems that the Ramah had. When he had written his Sefer, he saw the publication of the Magen Avraham in the Taz, the Magine Eretz, and he realized that most of the things that he wanted to write had already been written. He tried to salvage, like the Ramah, to some degree, tried to salvage his work by integrating minhagim, and he's a great source for minhagim from that period of time in Germany. But that wasn't published. He also wrote an extremely lengthy encyclopedia, which covers numerous things called Yair Nativ, numerous issues including poetry, music. Really was a
Wow.
incredibly diverse figure who knew just a tremendous amount, 17th century spirituality. One of my teachers, Professor Zartwersky, wrote a famous article on the topic, which focused a little bit on the tshuva we're going to look at today, and another tshuva on Kabbalah, and we'll mention that tshuva as well. I think it's wild. Here's my copy of the, but now it's available everywhere. If you wiki text my versions from Wikitext that I'm printed out, but my original version, he discusses why he called it the Chavos Yair. Now, Chavos Yair, of course, is based on a place in Eretz Yisrael, mentioned in Tanakh and several places in Tanakh. It's mentioned in Bamidbar. and the conquest of Eretz Yisrael under one of the children of Menashe, and then in Divrei Hamim and other places. We know where it is today. But Chava was his grandmother, and he named it. You almost see like a 17th century a concern or wonderful desire with this the like the Noda Yehuda Yechezkel Landau named the Tzlach after
Right.
his mother. The Chavos Yair named his sefer after his grandmother, who he said was a great lamdan. She knew Midrash really well. She knew Rashi really well, and discussed those issues with Talmidei Chachamim. Really fascinating. He had to travel a bit with his father because of the difficulties of the time period, and moved around. Eventually became, as I said, a rabbi in Germany. We're going to jump in on Tshuva 124 in the Chavos Yair, Kuf Kaf Daled, which just to put his dates, because we mentioned he's 17th century, so he was born in 1638 or so and passed away in 1702. His bar mitzvah is going to play a major role because the tshuva we're looking at is kind of a response to a bar mitzvah. Someone, a Talmud Chacham, asked him, "What should I start teaching my son?" It's reminiscent, I guess, of books like the Sefer Chinuch or something, which was written for a curriculum for a child, but it gives us a great kind of eye into one of the major post game. I mean, again, the author of not only his Chuvot, but the Makor Chaim, a major posek, and what he thought was the ideal type of curriculum, what to learn.
So this
Um,
is this is actually fascinating because you mentioned that his mother was well educated,
his
and
grandmother.
oh, grandmother, sorry, his grandmother, though if I remember correctly, you mentioned that she was well versed in Medresh, in Rashi. Um, he kicks off the tshuva by kind of critiquing the bar mitzvah. I mean, not critiquing the bar mitzvah book. He says, "Very nice. You gave a drasha, so you must have done some Medrash Rabbah Ein Yaakov." But he says, you'll get a shame lam done muflag. It'll give you a good reputation. Maybe you'll get a good wife. You'll get a good, people will turn to you. You'll get a good job. But he seems to not really rank Medresh high up there in terms of what a true Talmud Chacham should be spending their time in. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, which is fascinating for several points. One, and he comes back to this idea. He's clearly very critical of who he thinks people he thinks are phony.
Hmm.
So in regards to the Midrash, and especially something like Ein Yaakov, so Ein Yaakov, which was written in by Yaakov ibn Habib and then his son Levi ibn Habib, who were people who fled Spain, and eventually finished. I think it was published in Salonika in the 16th century, but the that's a compilation from Agadot in the Gemara. And if one has some expertise in these fun agadot, then they can kind of glorify themselves as, oh, I know everything. And he's clearly this is going to come up again in halakha. He doesn't like people who show off and pretend they're phonies when they don't have the fundamental basics. Now, it is interesting as a descendant of the Maharal, because Maharal we know wrote extensively on agadot, but the Maharal also wrote extensively on critiques of the curriculum of his day, and we'll see kind of a clear dovetail of Chavos Yair and his position of the Maharal, that you first have to really have fundamentals down and basics down before you get into Midrash. So I think he's going to say all Torah is wonderful. He's
Yes,
going to
he does.
emphasize
He
one thing.
does give that caveat.
Yeah, and that's going to be important for Kabbalah, which we'll get into as well. But one thing he says is critical in my version. I wrote a little version here with line in mine. I should have sent this to you, but in mine it's line 27. He says, "Shebekol chokhmah ikaro haseder v'hadraga hanichona." So in everything you learn, it's critical to make sure it's orderly and done in stages, step by step. You should never just try and show off that you know something when you really don't have a complete grasp of what's going on. And he says that's a problem. This is fascinating. This is a problem of twofold. It's hard to find a teacher, and
Hmm.
this he quotes his father as well. It's hard to find an honest teacher. Um, and it's also hard not to fall into peer pressure.
Mm,
So he says that he says he says al derech seder hamadrigot zor kashehu liachid af shu oseh muflag litnag Bo im beno af inim tselo lamdan muflag mlamed l'shem shamayim b'li ramiyah. Will he find, if you can find a teacher who wants to teach l'shem shamayim and is not a kind of a trickster, shein dato rak al b'tzil l'kabel pras, not someone who just wants to make money, but really believes in Talmud Torah. And then there's also the problem is, what are you going to do? Achar shekol alver kol bali batim asher b'neihem yilchu beta sefer yitvusu minhag b'seder limud havati hagun ma yaseh echad me'ir l'shanot litfos seder hagun neged kol chaverav.
right.
All his friends are learning this stuff. All his friends are quoting these things.
And
Um,
this is the challenge, is that I think Dr. Krakowski, he's at Azrieli, he wrote this essay one time about the difference in, I don't get too much into the weeds, of Haredi versus modern Orthodox high school education. And one of the things he mentioned, like the reason that the Haredi schools are able to teach some of these very technical Gemaras, and they don't have to worry about always finding, what's the practical tie-in, how's it meaningful in my life, is because their social dynamic is that the more Torah you study, the higher social status you have. In the modern Orthodox world, we don't necessarily, someone's social status isn't necessarily tied to how big of a Talmud Chacham they are. It might factor in, but that's not the be all and end all. So here he's noting something important, that even if I, on my own, identify what I think is the most important area to prioritize for a young man, I guess here it's a young man, or it could be a young woman also, why not? For a young person's development, there's still going to be that social pressure of people are going to look at him and saying, oh, that guy, he doesn't know anything. He's not studying, Chef Schmeisser or whatever he should be doing. So there's the social component, which is important as well. You rightly point out.
I think that's a real point in regards to the continuation of the tshuva, because he is going to, we're going to get to it in a second, but he's going to critique what's popular in learning, um, and we know that there's peer pressure, even school pressure for various schools to learn certain topics that he does not think students should be learning. He's going to return to this near later on in the tshuva, but I'll bring it up now. Kind of the great gadfly of learning is the Chod HaLevavot. In the introduction to the Chod HaLevavot, Rabbi Pekuda laments that people spend time learning esoteric halacha, and he defines esoteric halacha is for instance, learning Masechet Gittin, which all yeshivot in Israel learn Masechet Gittin, and he says that he even tells a story. The in the introduction, the Chod HaLevavot says that there was a Talmud Chacham, and someone approached him and asked him a kasha in Gittin, and he turned to the student and said, I've been learning Torah for 30 years, and never once has anyone asked me that shaila. Why are you worried about this? You should be worrying about your soul and perfection. And the Chod Levava, which spends a lot of time on Musar and also on theology, thinks that you should spend your time learning theology, and those things which he considers the Vavo considers practical, and we'll come back to Chavos Yair's kind of rebuttal to that.
But you're right, right. So I think it's important actually, because here you have a more of a Machshava sefer critiquing Lomdus style learning, something of course is championed by modern day yeshivos, by the Briskervelt. But he turns around and he criticizes those who spend their time studying Machshava. He says, Ubezeh yafa osin doros halalu shemisrachim me osin halimudim. It's better nowadays that we're distancing ourselves from this study. Ki tovi yafa lanu lebanenu lahamna munos amutamalenu beli chakira. He is of the school of thought that amuna pshuta, that simple faith without philosophical investigation, is superior. So he actually turns around and says, why are we wasting our time on Machshava?
Right. Of course, I would suggest, we'll get back to this at the end. We discuss practical issues. In that section of the tshuva where he laments, well, he says that again, he emphasized all Torah is wonderful. In a later tshuva, he has a very extensive tshuva on Reish Yud on learning Kabbalah, which he feels is Kabbalah is the most important science in all of Torah, but because it's so important, no one can really understand it, and therefore people should kind of stay away from it. But it's the neshama of all Torah, etc. But when he discusses these things, which by the way, it's fascinating because he is clearly an expert in all this stuff.
Yeah.
He quotes Kabbalistic books all across the board. He quotes philosophic books across the board. He quotes the Akira Yitzchak. He's a big fan of Akira Yitzchak. He quotes the Kuzari. He quotes the Sefer Karim. He knows these things very, very well. And he says that their earlier generations perhaps needed these things for Emunah, and we don't need them so much for Emunah. But he's writing the 17th century. I wonder if that's true today.
Hmm.
Like you said, a dichotomy perhaps between the Haredi world and the modern Orthodox world might be in how much time do we need to spend on issues of emunah. But I guess we'll go back a little bit to where he goes along. His first, after critiquing the problem of learning midrash or priding yourself and showing off your lamdan with midrash, and the difficulty of finding a teacher who will do things properly the way he sees them, which is again step by step, Keseder, and he does declare all Torah is wonderful. One thing he says is that there are a number of teachers that want to focus on issues of Choshen Mishpat. They want to learn the Bavas. They want to learn Lomdus in Bava Metzia, or like we're doing Daf Yomi and Bava Batra now. And, they want to pull out Rav Chaim and things like that. And he is very disturbed by it and says the teachers who teach this seem to teach it for one of three reasons. So I think we'll go through the three reasons because they're kind of wild. Before we get there, though, he does say, Hine, Vadai Talmud Ein Lecha Midah Tova Hemena. Learning Gemara is the greatest, but we're going to have to learn Gemara within a certain context. Achenu derech rachok ma'od ma'od. But the problem with learning Gemara is it is very slow, step by step. Ki im lamad im gefer hakavua sham b'limud klali. If you place your goal of learning Gemara, Rashi, and Tosafot, the great I don't know, triumvirate of Gefet, Gemara Rashi, Gemara Perush, and Tosafot, then you're only going to be able to cover a few Masechtot. And some people therefore want to jump to learning the Torah. He says Limud Turim v'Hasma, which is funny because I think he means the Prisha and the Drisha there, but that's how he clearly refers to the Prisha and the Drisha, all written by Yoshua Falk. So the Sma is really a Sefer Merodei 9, which is a commentary on, as we know, on Shulchan Aruch. But here, the priest and Drisha on the tour, and Pilpulim in those things, and he's afraid that is why are you spending your time learning Choshen Mishpat? They show off, they're challenging, but what's the point? He gives three reasons why teachers might emphasize this. One, that sometimes they'll choose it because the teacher wants to learn this stuff. By the way, that's an issue in yeshivot. Every year we say, what masachet do we want to learn? Oh, I don't learn this again. I was once in yeshiva where they discussed, I taught in yeshiva, and they discussed learning the same masachet 2 years in a row. And there was great groaning among the faculty, and one of the rabbis turned to me and said, look, if I teach the same Masachet again, my students will benefit because I know it very well and it's all prepared and it's thought and I can think for and I can present it very clearly and I won't have so many difficulties with myself. But it's no fun for me. I'll be bored. So what do I do? So one, the teachers worrying about their own education. I know in my world, one thing that comes up is what class can you teach next year? Oh, I want to expand my horizons. Let me learn something over the summer. I'll prepare a totally new course and, teach that for 2, 3 years. It's experimental. So maybe the first year is not, I've discovered the first year is always super exciting. You teach a lot and you're excited. The second year is never as good as the first year, because you're a little bored and you did it and you don't remember exactly how wonderfully you did it last year. And the third year is the best because the third year you overcome the boredom. You know this is what you're going to teach, but you have a little bit of excitement. But by the fourth year, you want to teach a new class, you want to teach something totally different. So one is people don't want to be on the same masachet, therefore they don't want to learn. They want to learn Choshen Mishpat, which is fun. Number two, they want the teachers feel like if they teach Choshen Mishpat Sugiot, the Babas and, those types of things, the Yeshivish Masechtas. So then what? Then people will think they're great Lamdanim. They'll come to them and ask them Shailas. Maybe they'll even appoint them as Dayanim. And that's a great thing. So a little bit of gaiva in the educational department. And number three, sometimes they want to improve themselves and things that, like you said, Shipschmeister or something. Something in the Lomdus area will improve their thinking, and that's great for them. They get a return on investment, but the student doesn't necessarily. And therefore, he says, and I love this. He says, so what should we do? That is, we should learn V'hu Chelak Orach Chaim. Orach Chaim is the choicest area of learning. V'acharav Chelak Yerodea. And then you should teach students some issues in Yerodea. So in other words, you learn Masechtot like Shabbat and Psachim and Sukkah and maybe Moed Katan, Beitzah. Those Masechtos, we learn Halacha very well. And then afterwards, perhaps you should learn some Chulin. Does this remind you of anybody, by the way, if you happen to know? Once upon a time, Rabbi Soloveitchik, when he set up Maimonides, so their curriculum, and I remember some people I knew teaching there lamented this because they said they couldn't change Masechtot. But at once upon a time, Maimonides High School, seventh and eighth grade, they learned Brachot, and then there was a rotation of Shabbat and Sukkah and Psachim and Chulin. I can't remember if they did
Wow.
Biblical once in a while, but those Masechtot because they're practical. You walk away learning halacha, and then he goes to critique of the Chod Levavot. So Chod Levavot says, "Oh, why are you learning things that aren't so relevant to you?" And he says, "Well, this is relevant." So it answers the Chod Levavot's kasha. The Chod Levavot says you should be learning things that you are practical. Don't learn Gittin. Don't learn, Avodah Zarah, whatever. I guess that's not just Yeshua Masechta, but don't learn, Bab Batra. So he says, you're right. I agree, Chod Levavot. You shouldn't be learning that, but don't spend all your time in the Kuzari either. Spend your time learning Orach Chaim, practically what you need to do. And therefore, he feels like he gets around that great challenge.
He's an equal opportunity, critic here. He's
Yeah.
criticizing, and this is what I wonder. He takes down Machshava, he takes down Lomdus. I don't know if we'll spend much time on it because as I like to tell all my guests, time flies when you're having fun. But he does critique heavy emphasis on Dikduk. He says you have to know the basics of grammar, but you shouldn't be spending all day studying Hebrew grammar, which I know, much to the chagrin of the those in the academic wing of YU where I was, who
Although,
loved
but it's
studying all that.
funny. It's fun. You're right. He does say you have to learn grammar. You must learn grammar. You must learn some basics. Don't get too involved,
Not
but you
libalos
really
yumam, not
need.
to like wear out your days on it.
Right, right. So they're your YU people. Maybe they can do that. But he says you have to understand you can't even daven correctly. People say Baruchu when it should be Baruchu. They don't know the exact, when it's just Shvanah, Shvanach, and just basic halachot. You won't know if you don't know the basic grammar. But he says binyanim. Don't spend all your time doing all these binyanim. That's not so critical. And then now I hear an echo of his great grandfather. He says, "V'nei limud hamishnayot hu mufchar shoragil adam et beno ma'at shezacha likor'o halacha barov hashas shomad imrabo perak echad mishnayot b'kol yom." Then he says Mishnayot. We know the Tosot Yom Tov Lippman Heller, who was a student of the Maharal, received that from his rabbi. The Maharal felt that before you got into looking at Tosafot and even Gemara, you really should have a deep background in Shas and Mishnayot. If not the whole thing,
So
at
Pirkei
least
Avos tells us.
what?
Yeah, it's what Pirkei Avos tells us essentially.
Yeah, yeah. How can you possibly go learning? But you see, that's not what happens. Often people want to jump right to Gemara. The 11-year-old kids are learning. You're doing Rav Moshe. So Rav Moshe has a beautiful vort on El Metzias, right? Why they start there? Because children don't understand property. They don't understand. They all want. They think everything is there. To teach them a little bit what belongs to other people, respect for other people. So that's a great Musar idea. And Chavos Yair says, yeah, they also have to know basic Hilchot Shabbat. So why aren't you learning
So,
Orach
so I
Chaim?
saw actually two different pshatim in why he started with Ein Metzias. One was that idea of learning Hilchos Ben Adam Lechavero. The other idea was either Ephraim Greenblatt or a Reuven who said it. He was afraid that kids from less from households would come home and start dictating the laws of Shabbos to their parents. And so start with something like Elu Metzias about Hashavas Aveda, Ben Adam Lechavero, lost objects, something that Shav L'chol Nefesh that anyone could get
Oh,
behind.
that's a
So,
very
so
nice.
it's actually like almost more of a modern Orthodox argument, you would think,
I've
than the
never heard that before.
Haredi.
That's beautiful too. That they're both beautiful. That's a really wonderful a wonderful idea. I always every year, at least once, if not multiple times, and it's coming up again. I give a shir in halacha biyun. I'm giving a shir in kind of a yom yun for everyone, so students who aren't in my halacha shir, on Maaseh Shabbat, on what to do when someone messes up. More about teaching people what not to do when someone messes up and you're in someone's home, and things that you think are a tragedy when really it's perfectly fine, and remembering that eating something which someone aired in Hilchot Shabbat is only a rabbinic prohibition, where Malbim B'nei Chavero, embarrassing
Mm.
someone publicly, is a deraita prohibition.
Right.
And
And,
that's
and the
something,
classic issue I also get just in my capacity as working as a communal rabbi, I get this question all the time that, oh, they reheated a liquid on Shabbos. So I said,
right,
okay, for Maisa Shabbos purposes, you could be somech on the Rambam that
right.
ain't bishul acher bishul b'davar lach. So that's important as well. Even before getting to the bein adam lechaver aspects, on a strictly halachic level, no action might be required.
It's funny. One of my students is a this year in my Shir B'Halacha, is his father is Yemenite, is Taimani,
Mm.
and he follows that Rambam and says that they put food straight on cold food. And he says people in the community, he's from Manchester, people in the community said are gagging and gas. The rabbi said you can't do that. I don't know why. He's simply following his Masorah, which is the Rambam, which is perfectly fine. But yeah, it's a funny issue that people get very excited. It's really a problem, I think. Maybe, the Chavos Yair is talking about people showing off how much halacha they know. There's also a danger when you don't know too much halacha, but you think you know. I give a share on this connected to Maaseh Shabbat when students are going back to America from Israel, to understand that your goal is not to be like Rosh Yochai coming out of the cave and attacking everyone all the time. That's just not. I think there's some yeshivot, or some people have an idea that maybe we can protect students if we get them to be zealous, but I think that's a real problem.
So I think there's something really fascinating biographically that comes at the end of the tshuva. So what actually happens? What's his conclusion here?
So he says that everything he spelled out, his father used to do with him. He mentions even his bar mitzvah, and he's coming close to that age. So this took place in I guess 1650. He says, "V'kach lamad hagon ani avi zatzal mibekol yom perak mishnayot imudei beit Rabbi." I guess also in school. Ad he got to the klal bachrut b'krei gefet b'kol hashas samach labiato l'kila kadosh Vermeister. So before he moved to Worms, which he spent a good chunk of his life, he had finished most of Shas with his father. So by Bar Mitzvah, he had gone through most Mishnayot, which he'd advocated earlier. And he thinks from his father's tradition, that's what you should do with students. And he says, if a person starts learning with their son Mishnayot, he says, "V'chi yachol hashimo b'kal b'gimel shanim." In 3 years, you can finish the Mishnah. I must admit, it wasn't just the Chavos Yair. That's what I did with my son. We finished Mishnayot for his bar mitzvah, and then people do that. He was quite precocious. It was started learning quite early. And then if you do that, you will have covered a large, significant segment of the background of Chokhmah. And then you can learn things like, once you start learning Gemara, Rashi, Tosfot, then the various things in the Torah, and especially the Rif. And then he says the Rush, and that was his custom, was to learn the fun of Achar Shalomad Gamkin HaRush, Shual HaRif, Ketosfot, Ketzarim, Al Shas. Not all the Tosafot, but short Tosafot. And you can develop, as he said, that's the methodology. Everything has to be in order. It has to be stage by stage. And you can really develop a student's intellect that way. And they will know the important halachot in their lives, and also learn how to learn. And don't waste your time. He says, He says, don't do me a favor, Koli Tishma, Ayiv Leb Bekach Zmano Bechilukim Becharifot Shel Hevel Hashem Ramten Rabim Ni Pashet Ma Shelo Matzinu Klal B'Divrei Kadmonim. So he says, learn the Rishonim. We're not sitting there trying to make what, excuse me, a Brisker Chakiras. That's not what they were doing. So he is advocating kind of we'll call it a neoclassical approach to learning Gemara and focusing on those issues. And he quotes a number of Achronim who agree with him, like the Shlah, who he's a big fan of. Again, talking about someone who was invested in Kabbalah. It's interesting. He doesn't talk about Kabbalah here at all. In the Tshuva, very lengthy Tshuva in Reish Yud, he has a lengthy response on whether or not one should learn Chukmata Kabbalah. And there, he clearly has complete control, complete shlita over the realm of Kabbalah, and talks about the differences between Kabbalah Ari, Kabbalah the Moshe Cordovero, Pardes Rimonim, which he knew very well, and just warns against people involving themselves too much in that. But in this tshuva about curriculum, he doesn't get there, but emphasizes over and over again what you should do is learn Mishnayot. He mentions Tanakh, and he says it used to be people spent more time on Mishnayot. Pirkei Avot recommends you don't start Gemara till you're 15. He says that's too late today because Mishnayot are printed. That was talking about in the time of Pirkei Avot when it was oral, but today it's printed. You can learn them faster. And once you have this very solid foundation, Tanakh, Mishnayot, basics in Halacha, Rak Hergel, Bincha, Ledakdek, Begefet, Hadek, Hetev, Hetev, Hadak, Bechetzer, Yitur, V'chalif, B'mkomo, B'mkomo, Achar Zeu, Charifut Shel Emet. And that he's crystal clear about. What's the goal? Emet. And what's the emet in learning? Learning Gemara, Rashi, Tosfot clearly, cautiously, and with great thought.
So this reminds me of something because you did me a favor and referenced my shiurim that I'm giving on Ramosha. I came by in my travels. You may have seen the post on this. In Reb Ruvain Feinstein's Pirkei Avos, Pirkei Shalom, there's a footnote there in which he says that you can paskin from the Dibros Moshe. That Moshe Feinstein shiurim were just as workable for halacha l'maisa purposes. And so I wonder how much it's kind of artificial, the bifurcation between Lomdus and halacha l'maisa. If the whole idea is that you want to get to the MS, you want to understand like what is the most likely grounded understanding of this sugya in Shas. Well, if you actually achieve the MS, it should work for halacha l'maisa as well. But if you're just doing Lomdus backflips, while that's fun and all, does that really get to the most essential part of the limud? I wonder how much this is a new idea of having a bifurcation between the Dayan and the Rosh Yeshiva in that respect.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, it's interesting when Rabbi Soloveitchik talks about control over the Talmud Chacham, and he's kind of giving a portrait of his grandfather, I guess, in the Eastern European halachic mindset, in halachic man. His portrayal of this ideal type of almost philosophic version of halacha and control over all areas of halacha, which is true. The Rambam in Parish Mishnayot, so he wrote on everything, obviously in the Mishnah Torah as well. In the introduction to Kodashim, so in Kodashim, he mentions that he's writing this because a lot of people don't involve themselves with this area. It's not very practical. People he's talking about, of course, the Rif. The Rif wasn't invested in those things. The Meiri laments how people didn't cover certain Masechtot, and it wasn't part of the normal limud because it was outside the range of perhaps practicality. And I don't know when this idea started to take over. He clearly is nervous. Chavos Yair is nervous about it, but eventually this idea of halacha, of Gemara being totally distant from halacha and what you're practically doing is something that he certainly is unhappy about and says it's not the best way to teach your kids.
Right. And with that being said, I'm just tallying things up over here. So he seems to take issue with kind of studying Medresh and Agada without a firm grounding in halacha first. He takes issue with focus on Lomdus, on just pure theoretics. He takes issue with studying Machshava when it's unnecessary. He didn't like apparently Rabbi Normland's Faith and Doubt essay, and he also takes issue again with going beyond the basics of Dikduk, even though his basics might be higher than most other people's basics, and spending all your day learning about the intricacies of them. And then even Mishnayos, which you mentioned, he seems to critique as well. He says this was in the earlier generations when they couldn't write down the Mishnayos. If we didn't
Well, that
memorize
was
them,
talking
we'd
about how
forget them.
long you should spend on it, right?
Right.
When he says that you don't need to spend up to year 15, but you should cover a good chunk of it first.
Right. And so what this leaves us with seems to be Gemara, Perish Rashi, Tosfos, going through the fundamentals. And I'm curious, in the
And then moving to the
biography,
Rif and the Rush and Halacha L'Maaseh,
right,
right?
the classical, foundational commentaries.
Right.
And I'm curious, you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that he had very wide interest, not just in Kabbalah as well, but also I think you mentioned possibly in, was it in poetry?
Music and yeah,
So,
everything.
so, where does that factor in? If he's busy critiquing all these other areas, not that he's saying you should never study them, but they're priorities. Um, where does poetry, where does the Mada figure into your time when all these things that are more classically part of Talmud Torah are already questionable?
Maybe he felt, I don't know, he doesn't mention it here. Professor Tversky in his essay kind of alludes to the fact that he was a bit of an elitist that thought certain things should be for the elites, such as eventually reaching to Kabbalah. Should be totally an elitist, if anything. Maybe no one should learn it anymore because we don't have the ability to unless you have a clear Masorah from person to person. So I don't know. He does, in this tshuva, he certainly doesn't open up any possibility for leaving that path.
Right.
For him, the golden path is foundational works. That's what you need to do, and foundational works for him is yes, in Tanakh, but Mishnayot, grammar, understand what you're doing, go to the Emet and go to Gemara with Rashi, Tosfot, and then Rif Rush
Right.
and understand the
What
halakha.
and one other thing that I see he doesn't address, and maybe this is anachronistic of me, and I'm asking this a little bit of navel gazing here as a podcast about Shalos and Shuvos. Is it a I'm trying to think, is it like a modern phenomenon that we kind of look at Shutim, we look at Shalos and Shuvos as its own genre to be studied? Was it back in the day just viewed as, oh, when you are studying the halachic literature, you will look at the Shuvos of the Rashba in order to understand how to paskin? He doesn't seem to relate to the idea of Shalos and Shuvos, of what we might call case law in one's curriculum.
Yeah, he doesn't mention that entire like element of the canon. That whole corpus of literature isn't even it doesn't I don't think it appears here at all. But again, he's writing this for someone who wants to know how to teach his son and what's the best kind of school curriculum almost.
Mm,
So maybe he just thought, okay, so if you're a Dayan, you can reach those heights, but maybe at this point in time, that's not
mhm,
what most people should be doing.
right.
Um,
So just
and
as
even though
a
people don't agree with me, I like the ending. So even people disagree with me, v'gam ani anochi afar ve'efer. Nonetheless, I'm going to give you my de'ah, what I think is the proper way to
right, there's a certain perfunctory amount of humility you have to put in, but clearly he has the credentials to make an assertion of this
yeah,
nature.
yeah,
As you
yeah.
said, he read through everything, and now he's telling you what he thinks is important to prioritize. So with that, actually, as we are wrapping up, I know that you picked this tshuva not just because it's interesting, but you yourself have an illustrious career of Jewish education. So I'm curious, if and how you may or may not use the guidance of the Chavos Yair when you are planning to teach classes to young
Well, I'll tell
people.
you one of the issues that I have, which I think is he doesn't directly address it, but I think it stems from it, is something I'm trying to wean myself from is commonly uh every rabbinic class, rabbinic literature class I know, they not in Tanakh, maybe in Tanakh even, they teach off of sheets. In other words, they take a whole bunch of sources and plop them down. And here, look at me, I have all these sheets. Students, I think, walk away having no clue what a book is. And people could say, well, we're in the computer age, that's okay. But it's not okay if you don't have a way to kind of put it all within a framework. I think that's really a problem. The problems that he addresses, I want to start again with the Mishnayot. I think that a lot of the high schools feel they have to jump to Gemara, which he says there's that peer pressure element. He emphasized that in the Tshuva. There's a peer pressure. The teachers want to do this. I don't know if I've seen students. Let's interestingly, it doesn't happen to boys so much, but in teaching girls, I have seen students who went, let's say, from the quote unquote frommer schools who did not learn Talmud, but when they come in because they learned so many other things really well that when they hit Talmud, they're running and can catch up and pass other students really quickly. So I think without having a foundation in Mishnayot, students come in all the time. Really, I would have never seen a Mishnah as a Mishnah per se. I mean, they went to like a Avodu Banim program and they heard, they learned a few Mishnah and Pirkei Avot. But to go through whole Masechtot before you touch the Gemara, I think that is so necessary. Whenever I teach Talmud, I always make sure, at the very least, you do the parak, but preferably to do whole Masechet before you hit the Gemara, because I think it's a problem that they just don't have that background. And to take that further, the desire to get to Gemara, 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 and then people teaching Lomdus as opposed to teaching halacha l'maaseh, I think that's also very important. It's one of the things I love to teach. I love to teach halacha l'maaseh, and I try now to teach out of the book. So I give a class now where we do Torah Shulchan Aruch, even with Shana Aleph students, because I want them to know how to find a tour. I want them to understand historically where the tour is, what the tour is, where it is, how the Beit Yosef is, how it relates to Shulchan Aruch, how it builds those pieces. As opposed to saying, here, I'm a really smart rabbi. Here's a daf of Makarot. I did all this wild stuff. Don't I know so much? When I really got it from the Beit Yosef because he did the work already. I
It's
think that's
tough,
important.
I totally hear that Yetzer Sahara and I have it, that you always want to make like a well-stocked Makoro sheet, especially like yourself, if you go somewhere and you give a lecture and then
You
after
have to.
Shabbos you're gone, that guy who comes to Shacharis Sunday morning, the only remnant they have of you is that Daf Makoros, and they're
Sure.
gonna judge you based on what's on there and what's not on there. So you want to leave them with a good business card.
Well, even just having the books, because you can't, when I sit and give a class, so I can tell the students, okay, I want to have a Gemara and a Torah Shulchan Aruch and a Rambam and a Mishnah Berurah. So first of all, they love it because now they've got like 5 books, 6 books stacked up, and it seems like, oh my gosh. Whereas you get them a Karot sheet, they just can't put everything in a place. I also like teaching Orach Chaim things. I think students need to know they're going to be balabatim. They need to know basic halacha. So it's nice that some places in my yeshiva also I try and push this. I think we should be pushing Orach Chaim sugyot for everyone, just like he says. I think
Right.
it's a great plan. They're going to go on for the rest of their lives. They need to know basics in halacha to live, to run a kosher home, Jewish home. You need to know halacha, and it's nice to spend a month in Chesed Batim, or whatever, like 6 months of Chesed Batim, but whether or not you're going to worry about opening a window and how that's going to affect the yard, which you're not going to do anyway, as opposed to understanding, Bishlach or Bishul on basic issues in Hilchot Kashrut. One thing that we try to emphasize, I know in my yeshiva's curriculum, is a lot of practical halacha. We do a lot of seminars on practical halacha, and we do a lot every morning. There's an element of several days a week of practical halacha.
And that's the thing. If one really delves into the sugya, many times when we talk about the dichotomy, the chakira between Lomdus and halacha lemaisa, many times people think halacha lemaisa means just dry bullet point halachos. But actually, if you're really doing it right, you are engaging with those Lomdusha concepts when you're thinking of nafkaminas between whether you go with the shach or the taz and X, Y, and Z. There is that same mode of thinking.
It's a
Um,
lot of fun. Students love it. Once you start pulling out the books and they're like, oh, that's so fun. Because they can you see, also it's fun historically. You can kind of feel like you're traversing. I love this part of it. You're traversing like the history of the Jewish people, jumping around different countries, different periods, and how everyone's relating. And you feel like you're part of the stream of Klal Yisrael for history of it. I think that's a wonderful thing of opening up Shulchan Aruch and going that direction, Gemara, Shulchan Aruch, etc.
Well, I think that's a really beautiful note to end on. The idea that we are traversing the Jewish people as we are studying the different books, taking them off the shelves. I did actually, when I was growing up, maybe it's changed, but in the Yeshiva Welt, there weren't these Makaro sheets. Maybe, maybe because the technology wasn't as acceptable. So people came in with those huge stack of books. It's a little bit
Good for
ironic.
them.
You would read literally one line from a book, but then it's this huge, thick volume that you get to slap on top of the other. It's almost like it's a power move to come in with that whole stack of books. But I think it's important that kids and adults, myself, we should know, like, where are these sources even coming from?
Right.
Like, what's the
Right.
difference between Rav Yaakov Emden and the Ritva? So
Right.
this is super important things to know, and I really appreciate you coming on the show to give us a tshuva the Chavos Yair and also give us understanding of how these principles could be applied nowadays in the 21st century. Hashem should give you continued hatzlacha in your Habatas Torah, and God willing, we should only hear good news in Eretz Yisrael very soon.
Amen. Amen. Amen.